losing allies, facing backlash, and many nations don't want French troops on their soil. And then some do not want any French wheat. Algeria, which historically relied heavily on France's wheat, seemingly does not want it anymore. The country has now barred French companies from a wheat import tender. Algeria's state grains agency recently conducted a tender and purchased over 500,000 metric tons of wheat, and no French firm was allowed to participate in the tender. The North African nation, in fact, had a specific request that the participating firms should also not offer French origin wheat. Algeria is one of the world's biggest wheat buyers, and for years it has remained dependent on France for it. But now that is rejecting French wheat, how will it fulfill its consumption needs? Reports suggest Algeria has turned to Russia. A big part of Algeria's wheat import tender was awarded to Russian companies. Russia's trade mission in the country says Algiers' purchase of Russian wheat are about to reach 3 million metric tons. So Russia is Algeria's alternative for wheat import.
Algeria's decision to sharply reduce purchases of French wheat in favor of increased imports from Russia marked a significant shift in global grain trade dynamics and underscored deeper political, economic, and strategic realignments unfolding between Africa, Europe, and Eurasia. The move did not occur in isolation. It followed months of trade tensions, quality disputes, price competition, and a gradual deterioration in diplomatic relations between Algiers and Paris. Taken together, these factors transformed what initially appeared to be a technical procurement decision into a development with broader implications for Europe's food supply chain. For decades, France had been one of Algeria's primary wheat suppliers, a position rooted in historical trade ties dating back to the colonial era. Algeria is among the world's largest wheat importers, consuming vast quantities to meet domestic demand for bread and other staple foods. French soft wheat, particularly from northern regions, traditionally dominated Algerian tenders due to geographic proximity, established logistics routes, and long-standing commercial relationships. However, this dominance had been steadily eroding even before Algeria's pivot toward Russian wheat became widely apparent. One of the immediate factors influencing Algeria's procurement decisions was pricing. Russia emerged over the past decade as the world's leading wheat exporter, benefiting from expanded cultivation, state-supported logistics, and competitive pricing strategies. Russian exporters consistently undercut European suppliers in international tenders, offering wheat at prices that appealed to import-dependent countries facing domestic subsidy pressures. Algeria, which heavily subsidizes bread to maintain social stability, has strong incentives to secure the lowest possible prices without compromising supply reliability. Quality specifications also played a central role. Algeria's grain agency revised its tender requirements to allow higher levels of certain grain defects, a change widely interpreted as favoring Russian wheat over French shipments. French exporters argued that these revised standards effectively sidelined their products, while Algerian officials maintained that the changes reflected practical consumption needs rather than political intent. Regardless of interpretation, the outcome was clear. Russian wheat gained a competitive advantage in Algerian tenders. The diplomatic context amplified the economic shift. Relations between Algeria and France deteriorated over disagreements related to historical memory, migration policy, and regional security issues in North Africa and the Sahel. Statements by French officials regarding Algeria's past and present governance triggered backlash in Algiers, leading to the recall of ambassadors and a cooling of bilateral cooperation. While trade officials on both sides insisted that wheat procurement decisions were commercially driven, the timing of Algeria's reduced reliance on French wheat coincided with this diplomatic downturn. Russia, meanwhile, actively pursued deeper economic engagement with African nations as part of a broader strategy to expand its influence beyond traditional markets. Wheat exports became a key tool in this effort. By offering competitive prices, flexible payment terms, and reliable supply volumes, Russia positioned itself as an alternative to Western suppliers. Algeria's shift toward Russian wheat fit neatly into this strategy, reinforcing Moscow's role as a critical food supplier to the global south. The implications for Europe extended beyond France. European grain markets are interconnected, and disruptions in one major export relationship can reverberate across the continent. France is the European Union's largest wheat producer and exporter, and Algeria had been one of its most important non-EU customers. A sustained reduction in Algerian demand forced French exporters to seek alternative markets, increasing competition within Europe and placing downward pressure on prices. This dynamic affected farmers, traders, and storage operators across the EU. Concerns about Europe's food supply emerged not because Algeria's decision directly reduced European consumption, but because it exposed vulnerabilities in Europe's agricultural export model. European producers face rising input costs, stricter environmental regulations, and increasing competition from countries with lower production expenses. Losing major external markets complicates efforts to maintain profitability and long-term production capacity, which in turn can influence future supply stability. The situation also highlighted Europe's dependence on external markets to balance domestic production. While the EU remains largely self-sufficient in wheat, export revenues help sustain farming communities and fund reinvestment. When export opportunities shrink, political pressure grows for subsidies or protectionist measures, straining public finances and intra-EU relations. Algeria's shift thus became part of a broader debate about the resilience of Europe's agricultural sector. From Algeria's perspective, diversifying wheat suppliers reduced dependence on any single country and enhanced food security. The government emphasized that ensuring stable bread supplies is a national priority, particularly in a region where food price shocks have historically triggered social unrest. By securing large volumes of Russian wheat, Algeria aimed to shield itself from volatility in European markets and potential diplomatic disruptions. Russia's growing role in global grain markets raised strategic questions beyond economics. Food exports increasingly function as instruments of geopolitical influence, allowing exporting countries to build leverage with import-dependent states. While Russian officials framed their wheat exports as purely commercial, analysts noted that such trade relationships often deepen political ties and open channels for broader cooperation. European policymakers expressed concern that losing influence in key African markets could weaken the EU's broader strategic position. Africa's population growth and rising food demand make it a crucial region for long-term agricultural trade. If European exporters are consistently outbid or sidelined, their ability to shape standards, sustainability practices, and trade norms may diminish. The wheat trade shift also intersected with global supply disruptions caused by climate variability and conflict. Extreme weather events affected harvests in multiple regions, while geopolitical tensions disrupted traditional supply routes. In this environment, importers prioritized reliability and affordability over historical partnerships. Russia's capacity to deliver large volumes through Black Sea routes, despite sanctions pressure, reinforced its attractiveness as a supplier. For France, the loss of market share in Algeria prompted introspection within the agricultural sector. Farmer organizations warned that declining exports could exacerbate financial stress, particularly for producers already struggling with rising fuel and fertilizer costs. Calls increased for government support and for a reassessment of trade strategies to maintain competitiveness. At the European level, the episode fueled debate over trade policy coherence. Some argued that stricter environmental and labor standards, while socially beneficial, placed EU producers at a disadvantage in global markets. Others countered that sustainability commitments should not be compromised, even if it meant losing certain export opportunities. The narrative of Europe's food supply in trouble reflected broader anxieties rather than immediate shortages. Europe continues to produce sufficient wheat for domestic consumption, but the erosion of export markets signals potential long-term challenges. If producers scale back production due to reduced profitability, future supply dynamics could shift, particularly under climate stress. Algeria's decision also sent a signal to other African importers. Several countries monitor Algeria's procurement strategies closely, given its size and experience in managing large-scale grain imports. A successful transition to Russian wheat without domestic disruption could encourage similar diversification elsewhere, further reshaping global grain flows. International grain traders observed that competition for African markets was intensifying. Russia, Ukraine, and other Black Sea producers increasingly dominate tenders once considered European strongholds. This trend reflects not only price competitiveness but also strategic investment in port infrastructure and shipping capacity. The long-term outcome remains uncertain. Trade relationships are dynamic, and shifts driven by price or politics can reverse under different conditions. France and Algeria maintain significant economic ties beyond wheat, and future diplomatic normalization could reopen opportunities for French exporters. However, rebuilding market share once lost is notoriously difficult. What is clear is that Algeria's pivot toward Russian wheat encapsulates a broader transformation in global trade. Traditional suppliers can no longer rely on historical relationships alone. Price, reliability, and strategic alignment increasingly determine outcomes in international markets. The episode underscores how food trade intersects with geopolitics, diplomacy, and domestic stability. Decisions about wheat procurement resonate far beyond silos and ports, influencing alliances, economic resilience, and perceptions of power. Algeria's choice, while grounded in practical considerations, became emblematic of shifting global balances. As global demand for food rises and supply chains face mounting pressures, competition among exporters is likely to intensify. Europe's challenge will be to adapt its agricultural model to remain competitive without undermining sustainability goals. Algeria's challenge will be to manage diversification while ensuring long-term supply security. The shift away from French wheat toward Russian imports did not signal an immediate crisis, but it revealed structural vulnerabilities and strategic recalibrations that will shape the future of global food systems. In that sense, the story is less about one country's procurement decision and more about an evolving international order where food, power, and influence are increasingly intertwined.